Good afternoon. Hold on, let's get this. The theme of the panel this afternoon deals with the structures of museums. And it's curious to come back to a moment when Max Weber spoke about the way that a science emerges, science in quotes. And he says at one point that it's not the factual interconnection of things, but rather the conceptual interconnection of problems, which forms the basis for new zones of inquiry. And in thinking about this question of the global museum, I've been, in my practice in the last 6 years, dealing a lot with the question of the structure pertaining to museum collections, and thinking about how museum collections can become a site for an understanding of something which I call the emergent, which has qualified all the work that I've done over the last 25 years as a curator, but where, in the context of a collection, the emergent takes on a much more critical potential, if you like. And so I would argue that you could see museum collections today as a site for a transdisciplinary and transcultural methodology of the emergent. And the proposition that I'm going to present you with today, without photographs, is based on an experience that I had in a highly contested museum in Europe. So I'm speaking from the point of view, in particular now, of Germany. A so-called ethnographic collection, because as far as I'm concerned, I don't really understand why it should only be called an ethnographic collection. And in the context of this so-called ethnographic collection, the hermeneutic process is radically unfinished. It's unresolved. The referentiality of the artifacts held in these collections is clearly not expended. It's not the same if you want to do a PhD on Tetra Pak or on something within the Design Museum, where you can find several PhDs. In the case of the so-called ethnographic collection, you may have a monograph written by an anthropologist or two, but if you think about the referentiality of these artifacts, there's a lot more work that could be done. So if you think about these collections within the context of a concept of the emergent, the critical emergent, then the collection is latent. In other words, it's there, but its presence has either been ignored or forgotten, and so you're often dealing with clearly a kind of a hierarchy of certain objects, and a lot of objects which are in crisis, which are in and out of power. This is what you could call the materia oscura, or the dark matter of these collections. The collection in a so-called ethnographic museum is also nascent. Its presence is coming into view once more by breaking through, and this is in a way the problem, breaking through a discursive and mythological fog of museum anthropology. And it's emergent because there quite clearly is an urgency to what's going on. There's a call for action to remediate the ethnographic collection before it's too late. And for some of you who may have read a piece that I wrote called Occupy Collections, I still wonder why it is that so little militancy operates around the stronghold and the possession of these collections in Germany. So it's about enacting the archive, giving space to a new set of connections, impressions, states, moods that constitute often emotional and aesthetic in the sense of Christoph Menke, where aesthetic is also about an experiment in life and not just academic intelligence. So the so-called ethnographic collection is therefore a collection of epistemic objects, in the words of Reinberger. These are objects that are in a state of definition with an unfolding ontology. They are, oddly enough, and they are by necessity connected to the colonial period, and therefore also to contrasting notions of the object. So you could come back to the idea of the objet ambigu by Paul Valéry, which dates from about 1921, And if you read Eupalinos, you'll see that at one point he speaks about, he's walking on the beach and he picks up an object and he says, this is something that has been rejected by the sea but can't be retained by earth. It told me at the time, I threw it back, and it told me at the time, it told me about the philosopher that I was and the artist I hadn't become. This is a very different notion of the ambiguous object, the unresolved object, than you might find, oddly enough, 6 years earlier with Duchamp and the ready-made. Now, for Paul Rabenow, who is perhaps for me one of the most crucial thinkers, who has borderlined anthropology with philosophy and is now just about to publish a book on Gerhard Richter. For Paul Rabenow, based at Berkeley, emergent phenomena are only partially explainable and only partially understood according to earlier interpretations. They require an array of hermeneutic tools, of approaches, of assemblages, and of neighborhoods. And here we come to the question of the building. Because the imperative today is, I think, very seriously to consider the architectonic and ergonomic environment of the museum, how we use the space, how we use the buildings. Architecture for the kind of concept work that I would hope to engineer becomes a priority as much as the architecture for exhibitions and for displays. So when you think about the new museum buildings that are being created in major metropolises in the world today, think also about the depot buildings that are being built, one in Frankfurt, one in Berlin, more often to save money on conservators, to centralize collections, and to make them, unfortunately, more and more inaccessible. This includes the archives of photographs. It also includes the kind of merging of libraries. Libraries in the context of the discipline of social anthropology are not only Warburgian, they're Bataillesque, they're everything you can imagine together. They have the most unlogical classification system. And as such, they also belong to this kind of very heterogeneous foundation of a colonial ethnographic collection. Now, I want to come back to something that Patrick Flores raised, and that is the University Museum, if only to discuss and to ask you to think about what you might consider to be a research collection. A research collection has a particular quality to it, which is that if you take the 19th and 20th centuries and you think back precisely to what Patrick was talking about when he mentioned Harvard, research collections became the foundation for a new episteme. They were there to define a department, sometimes to institutionalize a discipline, as was the case in Paris in the 1930s, with the collection of materials and linguistic recordings and numismatic research that was done across Africa in the 1930s. But they are expectant situations. Research collections are expectant and then suddenly they're superseded. So they are qualified by an anachronism as soon as the research has superseded the intentions of the original collection. This makes them quite interesting because they get abandoned very, very quickly. So anachronism becomes the fate and the patina of the research collection. It loses its charge, and in a strange way, it still manages to remain outside of the market. Very often, whether it's a series of objects that were used in physics or whether it's an archive of photographs, they don't often get released because the market isn't often interested in them unless they are ethnographic collections. And as you may well be aware, very little circulates today in contrast to the 1980s, where an auction would provide a moment where a serious object with great provenance would be sold. Nowadays, there's practically nothing that's circulating, and if it does, because of the internet, it's snapped up pretty much immediately. Now, the ethnographic collection did at one point become a research collection, was at one point a research collection. And today you could argue, well, could it become a research collection again within the period it's going to take to restitute the material? If you have 15 museums in Germany and many, many departments within universities, and a kind of total, if you tot it up, of about 5 to 6 million objects, the question is, what do you do with it? What do you do with these objects that have been, to 99%, author undocumented? You cannot say they're anonymous. You cannot say they don't have an author. It's just that in the pursuit of these collections, in the procedure of getting them back here, the author, the owner, the craftsperson, the artist, the maker, whoever you want to identify in the context of this biography, has been omitted. So they constitute, in my opinion, epistemic amputees. Moreover, the semantic mnemonic signs of the body of colonialism overshadow their polysemantic potential in the 21st century by proliferating memories and hauntings of their violent extraction. The problem of meanings defined from the perspective of authority and the authority of one ruling discipline, that of museum anthropology, means that interpretations are produced by proxy and legitimated by the anthropologists and the collectors through a discourse of provenance. Now, this leads to an administrative, legal, and discursive stronghold over the possible implementation of the collection for the purposes of contemporary remediation. In other words, the production of new meanings. So you have two major areas of conflict. The first one that emerges out of a reflection of this nature is a custodial authority versus curatorial experimentation. The second is conservation policies, and I think you're all aware of this, that we are dealing with a kind of double toxicity at the moment, in particular with ethnographic objects. They've been sprayed with arsenic and other things that are there to remove any kind of living being. In German it has the wonderful word entwesen. And like an Amber Alert against civic danger, these objects cannot be placed in a room with us because we could be contaminated from them. The second, more curious area of toxicity is that precisely those objects that fascinated the anthropologists the most, that were the, if you like, that conveyed life's unknowns, were the ones that contained saliva, sperm, skin, hair, nails, all those elements that today are potential triggers for the unleashing of new viral pandemics. In other words, the possibility of gaining access to these collections is becoming more and more and more reduced. The default that we are presented with in nearly all the debates surrounding the remediation of ethnographic collections deals with presentation. It deals with display, which is a mix of quite legitimate concerns as to how to exhibit these contested acquisitions from the colonial past, but it's also a move away from a deeper non-consumerist engagement with knowledge production based on these collections. Now, if the museum rethinks its spatial configuration, places a priority on a form of public research, then we begin to do what I would call concept work with collections. And concept work is about finding interconnections and terms that can act as parameters within which to exchange current research, ideas, concepts, and representations that in this particular case really radically need to be both transdisciplinary and transcultural. Artifacts in this case, once again, rather like the research collections in the past, become the central motor for all inquiry, and they have to be in front of you. It's not enough for them to be digitized. Nobody is going to take the last 30 years seriously, where every museum just spent all its time creating digital inventory systems. Yeah, we all know that an image is not enough. You look at it different. You have to look at the object. You have to have it in front of you. An activity of observation is slow, it's cyclical, it's recursive, it can be collaborative, but it can also be very private. And it has to happen beyond regionalisms. It's not possible that these objects get held and looked at within Southeast Asia, Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. The procedure has to be pretty much extreme open source. And by that I mean it has to go within a notion of source community, but it has to explode it at the same time. It has to be both indigenous and diasporic, and it has to, in a way, test out the options for new conditions of appropriation. I'll give you an example. If you come into a museum's collection and you want to appropriate the copyright of an object that you claim comes from your ancestors, in a legal context in Germany, you cannot appropriate it on the basis of an emotional relationship. If I give you, as a museum director, give you access to these objects in a museum laboratory, and you can produce derivatives, don't take this word derivative in a bad sense. You produce another version, like a dub plate. And it has proof of technicity. So you could be making something derived from a fish trap that may come from your background or may not. If you can prove technicity, then you can copyright it. But you cannot do these projects unless you have access to the material itself. Another area is to think about how you evaluate new work that is produced in a laboratory. I give you an example with the Weltkulturmuseum that I ran for 5 years. I invited artists and lawyers and writers to work with the collection. At the end of the period, at the end of the exhibition that emerged out of this recursive work, I was asked by the city of Frankfurt to name the value of the objects that had been produced there, the prototypes. Some of the objects in the collection have a value of €1, yeah? A mouth harp, €1. Others are given values which are completely conjectural because the objects cannot circulate, right? So they're done by looking at tribal art magazines and figuring out, yes, this object from Bamun, it must be worth about $500,000 because anyway the Met has the partner object, but it's completely conjectural. Now, if Otto Bongenkanga does a work and Tom McCarthy writes a new manuscript, or Luke Willis Thompson decides to hand over his money for the repatriation of a dead body in Frankfurt, how do I evaluate and place a financial amount onto this work? So these kinds of questions throw up not only the evaluation of the collection, but the market values related to the so-called research collection, which is what I'm producing in a museum. In other words, I'm producing a relationship, a dialogical relationship through the intervention of external thinkers and producers that is changing the nature of the evaluation of the object that they make. It's no longer part of the market. It doesn't make any sense for me to go to Fabienne Leclerc in situ and work out how much Otto Bongenkanga's artwork is worth in the context of this production, nor does it to try and figure out what Random House will charge for the manuscript of Tom McCarthy. So this is a kind of a process which has been called by Paul Rabinow remediation, and I think it's quite important in the context of the structure of a new museum because it means that we're dealing with a kind of observational cure, like an anti-educational model or an anti-psychiatry model. We kind of need an anti-museum model in order to come back to something which is going to decelerate and slow down what is going on. Now, this process, to conclude, is not exclusive to ethnographic museums, only it's aggravated in their context. You could compare, for example, the dating and naming procedures that you find at the Schaulager in Basel with the dating and naming procedures in the collections of the Museum der Kulturen in Basel. And it's shocking to see the difference. And like I went with a group of students quite recently, at the end of the seminar, the students wanted to work in the collection of that wasn't the Schaulager, rather than in the collection of the Schaulager, where the conservation and the epistemes are completely formulated. But the issue of access is totally, totally crucial. Not only the issue of access, but the importance of having an external person coming into the museum and in dialoguing with the custodian. You cannot heal a sick institution from the inside. And it's this external knowledge that is causing problems in the current condition of ethnographic museums. It leads to a clash of expertise, a conflict over ownership, and the expectation at the end of the day that something has to be delivered to the public. But there's nothing to stop the public from being involved in this kind of remediation process, on the contrary. And that's why I would argue, to complement Patrick, not for a university gallery, but for a museum university, for a priority that could be given to the remediation of these millions of objects that by no way have been expended in terms of referentiality. And the methodology of the emergent that this brings with it is something which, to criticize my own position, is highly connected to the fantasies of anthropological discourse. You can't get away from it. Yeah? You're looking for something that you haven't yet found. And yet, in today's world, there's every reason to suppose that for people who have moved to a new city, it's the open-endedness of something that hasn't been given a finite definition that can allow them an area of entry, that can allow them then to add their interpretation, their sense of meaning to something which until then has remained, in quotes, foreign. So these, if you saw collections as a collaborative platform, we might come back to what the old man said in 1975, when he said, and I'm talking about Joseph Beuys, let's turn museums into universities and have a department for objects. The museum, he wrote, could offer the first model for an ongoing and permanent conference on cultural issues. Thank you very much.